Okay, so moving on. Like I said, I'm going to start talking about shifting global requirements, changes ultimately in the regulatory context, and global trade that apply to you as the East African exporters to the EU. Firstly, we're going to start off with a general picture in terms of extended producer responsibility, as this has sort of ignited a lot of the regulatory shifts that are going on, not just in the European continent, but around the world. So as you can see from the graph itself, EPR in short for packaging is wide reaching across the world, represented by the dark blue shaded countries. However, in the countries shaded both blue and white in a diagonal fashion, EPR is currently in discussion in these places, and we expect it to be in place in the future at some point. And then finally, the non-colored countries itself, EPR is not in place, but it doesn't mean it's not going to be in place forever. So why are we all here? So looking at a map regarding the PPWR applicability, we can clearly see that in the EU, or countries that are member states of the EU at the very least, the PPWR is applicable. However, this doesn't mean that the PPWR, in terms of the packaging waste regulation, is not applicable around the world in the various continents that you can see that it is not directly applicable. Ultimately, this regulation covers anybody that exports and places products on the market within the EU. And in this case, East African exporters that represent some of the industries that Sarah talked about, such as coffee, tea, green beans, and various other horticultural products as well. So very important for all countries and exporters to understand what these regulations entail when they come into effect and how they need to adapt going forward for this new reality of compliance. So getting to the main course, what is the PPWR? So there's, of course, as you can see, there's a 137-page document, but I've synthesized it into a few points here. So ultimately, the PPWR in the regulation itself mandates harmonized design for recycling. And this concept, design for recycling, I'll unpack later on. So do make a note there, a key note in terms of design for recycling as a concept. Furthermore, it mandates post-consumer recycled content inclusion. So what does this mean? The inclusion of recycled content within a packaging material. And that as well, I will unpack later on in a little bit more depth. Furthermore, it discusses deposit return schemes and how they will apply, as well as the participation in extended producer responsibility schemes, which I believe a lot of us should be very aware of at this stage of things. Then furthermore, proceeding through the list that I put there, harmonized labeling requirements, also restrictions in terms of certain packaging formats and materials used, ultimately to promote recyclability. Furthermore, there's establishing reuse and refill targets, which are also key in terms of achieving tangible results as part of this packaging waste regulation. And also as well setting waste reduction targets. Those, of course, aren't all that are encompassed by the regulation itself, but it's a huge plethora of items as well. But these are some of the core points itself. So as mentioned, it's a new reality, a change in paradigm that we're coming into. And this is depicted by the graph in terms of what effect the packaging waste regulation will have on industries, and then of course waste generation going forward. So the orange line itself that you can see slightly exponentially increasing discusses a business as usual scenario where we can see packaging generation, waste generation steadily increases in the absence of these targets. However, when we look at the green bars as well as the purple bars, in line with the PPWR's dates, such as 2030, 2035, and 2040, which are key dates in regards to regulation, we can see specific general packaging reduction targets, as well as estimated real reductions against the baseline. So this is the effect that we hope that the implementation of the PPWR will have, and I'll further unpack this in terms of how this will be achieved going forward. So there's a few core areas of focus in terms of the packaging waste regulation. Number one, a recyclability performance grade. Like I said, this specifically is an important point because this will apply to all packaging that is aimed to be placed on the market in the EU. And ultimately, what is it? It's one score that tells you if your packaging can be theoretically recycled, given today's technologies in the respective EU member states. Ultimately, this grade will permit market access or not. Furthermore, another area of focus is recycling at scale. So this represents proof that existing plants can actually handle the formats that are placed on the market, taking material sorting into account. Recycled content inclusion, a concept that I discussed a little bit earlier in this presentation. So ultimately, the percentage of verified post-consumer or post-industrial material designed into the pack. This can be anything ranging from 5% to even 50% of post-consumer recycled content included into the packaging itself. And then finally, we've got reuse requirements. So a regulatory mandate that business-to-business containers be cleaned, inspected, and returned for multiple times. So I hope that's all clear for you all. And like I said, these are concepts that I will unpack gradually throughout the presentation. So starting off with, what is a packaging? And this is covered in the design for recycling concept. So you can see a graphic here in regards to actual bottle itself. And I could estimate this bottle could be a HDPE plastic bottle in this case, or polypropylene bottle in itself. And packagings themselves are made of various different components, as you can see annotated there on the screen. So we've got the closure systems and small parts as well. So yes, you can have things like pumps, caps, and other types of variations within closures as well. However, contained with those closures, you can have things such as springs and silica gels and other types of different components as well that support the actual packaging itself, emptying the product contained within for consumer use. Different colors as well, so they make up the makeup of the packaging itself. Additives also, those are things that could be like master batch that enhance the color of the packaging itself. Another important point there is adhesives. So the adhesives job potentially in this packaging is actually sticking the label of the packaging to the actual bottle of the packaging, which the label itself would contain consumer instructions and other important bits of information for terms of use of the product and the packaging itself. Barriers and coatings. So coatings could be things like varnish, barriers as well, dependent on the type of packaging. Flexible packaging tends to have different types of barriers that separate the layers between flexible type packaging. So things like, let's say, coffee packaging itself, they could have a barrier known as EVOH that combines the two layers or even the three layers in some case of the flexible packaging itself to ensure use. And then I've touched upon labels and also sleeves. So sleeves can be, 50% coverage of the bottle, 100%, or anywhere in between. Those are also key important considerations when it comes to design for recycling and how the packaging will be sorted appropriately in the facility. Excuse me. And then material composition, things like inks, printing, and ease of emptying are all considerations when it comes to developing a recycling performance grade. So as mentioned in the previous slide, the recycling performance grade, as you can see to the left of the screen, are very key scores when it comes to permitting market access or not. So breaking down this concept, generally speaking, we have three grades that are key, particularly in the years of 2030 to 2035, and I'll unpack them for you just now. So scoring A, B, or C grade in regards to the packaging's recyclability against the requirements stated in the PPWR and the various assessments that determine this will enable that packaging to have market access to this market. And this grade constitutes of an assessment in terms of the total weight of recyclable material. In this case, I can give you an example of a packaging that has, let's say we have a 90% in terms of weight percentage of packaging, a HDPE bottle, a 90%, and maybe the remaining 10% is a metal packaging or a type of metal material, whether it's steel or aluminium. Just looking at the weight percentage alone of that 10% split between plastic and metals, excluding all other assessment criteria, the weight of recyclable material would potentially be 90%. And looking at the year 2030, it would potentially permit a B grade, of course, coming over the threshold of 80%. But unfortunately, in this case, it's not just one scenario looked at. There's various other assessment criteria looked at when determining a recycling performance grade, such as ease of emptying and other factors as well. So it's very important that packaging producers are cognizant of this and then, of course, have their packaging assessed. So bringing you to 2038, as you can see at the very bottom of that screen, you can actually see that regulations become more stricter in terms of the actual performance grade that will permit recycled access. This is depicted by only A and B grades assigned to packaging, allowing or rather being permitted to place their packaging on the market, where previously the C grade used to be allowed, but this thoroughly communicates that a continued design for recycling and a thorough approach is definitely considered here. Then lastly, we have the recycled at scale. This comes in at 2035 onwards, which, like I said previously, essentially evaluates the compatibility with the packaging with existing recycling streams and systems as well. So I hope that's all clear. And if there's any questions, like I said, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're happy to answer them throughout this presentation. So I've talked about recycling performance grades, and these can be essentially assigned via certifications. And there's two different categories of certifications for different types of packaging. So packaging either fits in the finished packaging category or the semi-finished packaging category. So the finished packaging category is ultimately an exporter, in this case, that is shipping directly to the supermarket shelves within the EU. Ultimately, they're not selling on to another organization to add other features onto the packaging. They're selling directly to customer or in this case, supermarkets. So two certifications could apply for the packaging producer. In this case, we have the recyclability certification, which is the most thorough at that, where claims can be made on the actual recyclability of the packaging itself. And then furthermore, there is a more general design for recycling certification as well that applies to finished packaging. However, in this reality, like I said, we're looking at the exporter market as well. So we have a semi-finished packaging category where a letter of compatibility certification can be carried out and conducted for exporters that may be selling their packaging to an end customer in the EU or organization at that may repackage part of the products itself. So this the category of certification would widely apply there. And I've put some graphics below on the screen to basically highlight the type of certificates that are produced as part of this certification process that can be shown as evidence that your packaging has been assessed in said design for recycling format. Okay, I hope that is clear. And like I said, if there's any questions, happy to answer them throughout at some point in this presentation. So, recycled content, I did discuss this being another core area of focus, and so I'll unpack this a little bit more. Recycled content is a core part of the regulations to have included in the packaging. So we can see contact sensitive plastic packaging, specific targets from 2030 and 2040, where 30% and 50% recycled content respectively is aimed to be included. However, an easier scenario for everyone all to comprehend here is a single-use plastic beverage bottle, let's say a water bottle in this case, which is mainly PET. From 2030, there is a target of course, 30%, and within 2040, the recycled content target more than doubles at 65%. This ultimately stimulates the recyclable materials market and ensures that virgin materials are not continuously used to achieve this in effect. So then I've talked about all this different information in terms of recycled content, certifications, and of course, giving you a larger picture in terms of where the PPWR is directly applicable and indirectly applicable. So you have a lot of information that arms you in terms of what this regulation is in general. And you're probably wondering, what can we do now going forward as an exporter? So there's a few concrete actions that you can do in terms of an exporter of different packaging materials, whether you're, shipping towards a organization that's going to repackage your materials, or as well as shipping directly to supermarkets. So number one, you can quantify your exposure to this regulation across your portfolio, as this is an additional piece of admin, but very critical at that. Considering the design for recycling philosophy, so ensuring that your packaging is designed to actually be recycled, and there's various things you can do there, such as operational sorting tests with both ourselves and GFS East Africa, to actually understand, is it recycled in the current infrastructure within the EU. We also can do, like I said, test and certify different formats. So you can choose a large sample of packaging formats that you often sell within supermarkets or different areas of the EU, and see where they perform right now to understand what changes you need to make ahead of 2030, as it's very imminent in the short term. So once we've done all of that, securing feedstock early. So understanding what suppliers provide the adequate material that can be actually recycled and compliant to the PPWR, and locking in certain supplier deals and contracts to ensure that you as the exporter and the packaging producer are uninterrupted by this changing landscape. Then moving on, you can establish communication requirements of your suppliers. This ensures transparency across the supply chain. More often than not, some suppliers may not be aware of the actual changes and why they need to adapt. So ensuring that they are well informed will ensure the ease of transition in this regard. And then moving on as well, this will facilitate upstream and downstream traceability. Your suppliers making changes, you yourself as the exporter and the packaging producer doing tests and certifications, and having a documented thorough report and a certificate at that that is traceable towards the specific packaging format or formats in question. And then finally, which is very important as well, communicating these specific requirements to leadership. You as the actual exporter yourself, or maybe the packaging designer, is cognizant of these changes, but communicating the risk to your leadership as an organization is also very critical to ensure that things move very quickly ahead of this change. I hope that was clear. Like I said, any questions, feel free to type in the chat. So how will this affect East African exporters? There's a few points here. This doesn't represent all the potential areas of effect to this group of packaging producers and exporters, but is also key to note. And I've just seen a question in the chat, which I'll pick up on later on. So exporters from East Africa are considered packaging producers under the PPWR. Yes, of course, the packaging is produced or shipped from East Africa, but ultimately that's where the packaging is generated. So accountability assigned for material put on the EU market is to this group as well. So very important to maintain market access is for this group of people to become accustomed to and adapt to the requirements. Market restrictions and product rejections for non-compliance. This is a reality. It's very important to maintain market access, and failing to adapt to these requirements is something that is critical in this case. So this can contribute to loss of investment. Particularly it can be farmers that are growing coffee for a number of years, or other types of horticultural products, whether it could be green beans or other types of products themselves. There's a huge amount of investment put in to generate these products. So actually not adjusting and ensuring your packaging aligns with these requirements would be such a shame in terms of the hard work that has been put into to provide food for the EU. So additional administration for East African businesses. So exporters required to provide evidence of packaging recyclability in accordance with the PPWR. Like I said, I've given you examples of different types of certifications that can be done, which of course GFS East Africa in partnership with ourselves at CircPac can accomplish and guide you through the process towards gaining such evidence. Moving on as well, multiple packaging formats are affected. So I've mentioned there's different packaging formats such as plastic, fiber, metals, and glass, and there's subcategories as well of materials that are affected. So it's not just one specific type of material, it's everything across those material formats and categories that I've discussed, and their derivatives as well. And then also as well, value chain compliance, which I'm sure I've drawn out in this presentation. So it's very important to speak to your suppliers to understand how they are preparing for the PPWR. And is this something that they are considering? And when are they looking to adjust their material sourcing or other types of operations? And if not, it's very important for you as the packaging producer to potentially look for alternatives if this is something that is not being addressed by your current suppliers. Okay, maybe I will leave that question to the end and just make sure I just proceed with this conversation, but I'll be sure to answer that question that's in the chat. And any more questions, do let us know. So why design for recycling? This is a concept that comes up a lot, and we hear in conversations in our world of recycling. Why we should get there and positioning as an advantage. So design for recycling, as you know, is the new status quo. It's something that we're all at some point going to have to follow as a result of the changes and implementation of new regulation. So this is insurance for market access, as discussed via the packaging waste regulation. Meeting specific recyclability grades will ensure market access is maintained. And there's different grades that can be assigned to prove such. A cost defense as well. So recyclable, high post-consumer recycled content inclusions within packaging in some jurisdictions allow the lowest modulated EPR fee tiers and escape any potential supplementary taxes. And of course, this depends on region to region. So very important to check and verify that, depending on the location that you're exporting to. But in most cases, this has been something that has been implemented. So there's additional savings that can be unlocked there. So furthermore, value chain alignment. So ensuring that your value chain is PPWR ready. So packaging that already matches recyclability design for design guidelines and post-consumer recycled content quotas is a huge USP, particularly when looking for new outlets for your product, new supermarkets, and new avenues to sell your product. Those that are not are, of course, going to struggle when these regulations are thoroughly implemented. And then finally, as well, margin protection and supply hedging. So ensure you lock in early redesign to ensure that you're uninterrupted by these changes in regulation. So very important there to do so. So how do we take advantage? And these are tangible things that you as an exporter, packaging producer can look at as well. So 4 sort of main categories, 2 internal and 2 external that I've displayed here on the screen for you all. So scanning your portfolio for potential PPWR readiness, understanding how your resins, your formats, and other products fit into this new world, and what part of your portfolio would you need to adjust and redesign to ensure that you're uninhibited in terms of your market access currently and into the future. And very important, like I said, to highlight and flag the high-risk items and establish a clear plan to become and get compliant. And that's something ourselves at GFS East Africa and CircPack can support you with going forward. Furthermore, start sourcing post-consumer recycled content in your value chain. Find trusted PCR suppliers and agree on basic quality standards that meet the EU requirements. And lock in these supply deals to ensure volumes and prices stay stable. So this advice and point here unlocks additional savings for your organization, which is very critical. So those are the internal things that you can do. Moving on to the external things that you can do as a packaging producer and an exporter from East Africa is to educate your customers about the packaging waste regulation. So to highlight the gap that most suppliers may be falling short, leaving risk to retailers exposed in that regard. However, positioning yourself as the low-risk partner by providing your packagings, or rather displaying that your packagings themselves already meet the compliance requirement of the packaging waste regulation, is also very key to ensure that your customers remain, and also they understand that you're doing something in regards to the environment, and then ensuring that your packaging or the packaging that they use will be recycled and not have an undesirable destination. And then finally as well, in terms of what you can do externally, is to come prepared. So present your design for recycling certificates, look at the EPR fee models, and have a traceable post-consumer recycled content supply chain. This ultimately can help you quantify the cost savings as well as the risk reduction gained by partnering in this endeavor. Thanks, I hope that was clear. Any additional questions? Like I said, feel free to pop them in the chat. I see a few now, which is great. So looking at the solutions, because you know, there is a lot of fear potentially in the market. However, there's definitely solutions that can be found. So if you do lack a PCR certification for specific materials, you can actually look at a switch to bio-based materials in that regard. If you predict a bad recyclability grade for a specific packaging, you can reconsider designing your packaging format so that you can continue selling that product on the market itself. So there is a solution there, and we can support you in that redesign as well. If you lack any clarity on design for recycling guidelines, we can use a harmonized reference. So us at CircPack, we have design guidelines that we publish fairly regularly and update fairly regularly on all the different packaging materials and material formats, such as plastics, fibers being paper and cardboard, metals under steel and aluminium packaging, as well as glass packaging themselves. So we have clear design guidelines that are freely available on our website to engage with and understand some of the preliminary changes that you can make. However, it's also very important to test and certify your packaging, because that's a more thorough approach to ensuring matching up to the changes in the packaging waste regulation. So, summary and closing. I know I've talked a lot, so we are at the end, or close to the end at the very least, and we'll get to your questions fairly shortly. So I'm going to bring it together. So there's a few areas of immediate focus. So considering design for recycling, that's in red, so very important. Recycled content inclusion, looking at how we can include recycled content in your packaging in line with the targets stated previously in this presentation. There's, of course, reuse requirements as well for business to business, as well as documentation internally and in terms of the supplies that they can do. Areas which require further rulemaking, biodegradables. This isn't something that has been really broadly elaborated on, really. So any challenges in packaging formats, an option is to switch to biodegradables due to I wouldn't say incomplete, but more so the very premature sort of guidelines on biodegradables. And then lastly as well, areas of additional concern, labeling requirements, food contact requirements, supplier locations, where you're going to source your suppliers from in the event that they're not PPWR ready. And also new EPR and eco-modulation rules, as well as B2B and B2C final distribution. So thank you all for tuning in very attentively to this presentation. I'm going to hand off to Sarah. Maybe she has a few words to say, and yeah, we'll get onto your questions very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luther, for that comprehensive discussion and presentation. I'll read for you the questions, and thank you. I see you're sipping your cup of some water. That is. I'll read for you the questions. Since there are not many, I'll first read the 3 that we have here. And then if you would want to ask your question directly, just raise up your hand, and then I'll be in a position to unmute you, and then you can ask your question. So question 1, to what extent does the PPWR align with the UK's EPR scheme?
So this is something that is, as we approach 2030, more clarity on how the packaging waste regulation of the EU, which will affect all EU member states. The UK, as we know, is not a part of the EU right now. However, other European countries that are also not part of the EU, including the UK, we can expect equivalent regulations that mirror in some places the packaging waste regulation. So in this regard, there is a concept known as the recyclability assessment methodology, or the RAM as an acronym, that is somewhat similar to what the PPWR is aiming to achieve, but in the UK. So I advise you to, look that up, as well as we're happy to have a longer conversation, maybe on a one-to-one call with both myself and also Sarah as well, to unpack this a little bit further. So in short, the recyclability assessment methodology is something that will come into place in the UK and will align in some places with the packaging waste regulation. Yes.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. The next question is, at what point of, I think you meant exports, will the PPWR compliance be checked?
Sure. So having a look at the actual document itself, it's still the regulatory document. It still hasn't clarified it specifically. And I think the logistics itself is something that requires maybe working out, as these are physical products that are moved in large volumes. So I expect more news to come out in the upcoming months about this, as 2030, yes, it's very close, but also it's something that is not exactly next year. So as we approach, closer to 2030, this is something that will be unpacked a lot further in terms of guidance. Yes.
The next question is, if I export products and carry out recyclability assessment with sorting tests like you mentioned in your presentation, is it applicable in all EU countries?
Yeah, so we can do assessments, particularly the recyclability certification, where we would do, dependent on your packaging format, but for example, we can do an operational sorting test to see whether your packaging is appropriately sorted into the relevant actual fraction within the facility. And then we would do a more thorough theoretical assessment on the different components of the packaging itself, and provide you with a recyclability certification that applies to all EU 27 plus 3 countries. So the plus 3 in this case would be Switzerland, Norway, and the UK. So I would advise that to ensure maximum applicability for all EU countries, to answer your question. Yes.
Thank you. I didn't see any other question. We have few minutes, 10 or so, for any other questions. If you want to ask your question specifically, just raise up your hand and then I'll be able to unmute you.
I think we've got a few people typing.
Okay.
So assessment is required instead. Ultimately, the recyclability assessment methodology is something that is still being defined in the UK. The fact of the matter is, yes, the PPWR is coming in 2030, but there may be some updates, in regards to its applicability, etc. But at this stage, in terms of certifications that are available, we can cover the EU 27 plus 3. But once the RAM assessment has been finalized, that applicability may not apply, and there may be a specific RAM assessment. So these things, of course, can be flexible. And one thing to note in terms of the certifications, just to give you a little bit more information, certifications are valid for 3 years, and are encouraged to be renewed. This is in line with advances in packaging science, advances and updates to regulation, etc. So there's generally a 3-year window in terms of when your recyclability certificate is valid for. Hopefully that answers your question, but happy to unpack further on a direct call if need be.
Any more questions? It looks like you were very precise. People understood everything. Or, as in school, we used to be told people didn't understand anything and they're still trying to digest whatever you've said.
Let's hope it's the former.
Okay, fine. So since there are no more questions, I think I would like to, I see my colleague has, I'd like to call Nyreen Jones, my colleague, to say thank you and to tell you the way forward. I'm sorry, Nyreen, I've thrown you under the bus.
Maybe he's left the meeting.
No, he's in the meeting. Nyreen, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, fine. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this comprehensive webinar. on the EU PPWR regulations and what the East African exporters need to know. They will continue doing a series of this after every 2 months, just to make sure everyone is ready on what kind of discussions that are going to be carried on, that are currently ongoing in Brussels and in the UK. This means that 2030 is not very far, but we all, as you all know, that East Africans, we tend to trade a lot with the EU and the UK, and we depend a lot on that as well. So as this gets closer, we don't want to find ourselves and businesses in market restrictions, and we would want to get you ready. If you'd want to know more and in detail how you can actually, you and your organization that you represent, association that you represent, kindly reach out to me or Luther, both of us, and we'll jump into a call with you and anyone else in the leadership of your organizations to walk with you through this journey all the way to 2030. And even after 2030, as people continue navigating on how to actually comply onto the new regulations. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and have a lovely morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you, and bye.